Good morning, everybody. That was a pretty cool little snack. There's always this magic thing of when you're doing something you've not done before, and there's that little apprehension of uncertainty, right? So I enjoyed that, and I hope you did too. I'm always pleased to follow Peter. Where's he gone? He's run away. But Peter Geldenhuys, because he always gets the grey matter going and startles you with some of the implications of what we're seeing around us. I've been asked to talk a bit about that as well, but I'm coming at it from a different angle, perhaps. My area of interest is strategy, very simply, how we compete. And of course, that's immediately linked to the question of leadership, which has to do with how do we make these things happen. I want to talk about a few things that I think are going on around us. But one thing for sure, I think, as a proposition, is how we've got in the room and what we're doing in the room is not how we're going to get out of the room. So your industry, your sector is going through these quantum changes that are extraordinarily exciting because they're going to change the way we work and live. And so too in engineering and in science and technology, we faced as a generation with this incredible pace. About the only American English that I like was an expression that someone once said, is you can't jump a chasm in 2 jumps. A chasm needs 1 jump. And very often as I travel around the world and look at the things that are moving in the US or Europe or Asia, and I come back home to ORT, I see the extraordinary positive and challenging things happening around the world. And I come home and I see the extraordinary positive and challenging things that are happening here. You've chosen an interesting venue. So if you look through those curtains, you know that you're looking at Alex. How far is Alex from Sandton? Well, it depends what question you mean. I would argue for most of the residents of Sandton, Cape Town is closer than Alex. Maybe London is closer than Alex. We're a country going through this tumultuous, multi-generational, multi-decade process of change. And then I look at Sandton behind us here, which is kind of a construction site. I was taking a professor from Harvard around. Harvard is trying to figure out where to put its African office. And so he'd been to Dubai, strangely. He'd gone to Nairobi and Addis. And then he went to that place where I come from with the mountain. And he quite liked that. He'd never been to Joburg, and he got stuck here. There was a blizzard in Boston, and his flight was delayed for a day. And I was asked, could I just look after him for 3 or 4 hours and take him to the airport? I said, sure. Very bright guy, 9 languages, 54-year-old China expert, why not? So we drove into the gridlock of Sandton. And the traffic jam, 5 o'clock, and he said to me, but this looks like Los Angeles. I said, it is, but it is Los Angeles. This is the center of the center of the center of the African economy. That's exactly where we're sitting right now, and we're doubling it up. And in a few square kilometers are the best businesses, the best institutions with the best infrastructure on the biggest scale by far in the entire continent. And then I said, why don't we pop over the bridge to Alex and walk around there? So we did. And I got him out of the car and we walked around some of the shacks and the ShopRite Checkers and watched the goat run out the front door of ShopRite Checkers. And he said, he said a lovely thing that you'll get because you're creative people. He said to me, who's the idiot that put the freeway between them? Isn't that a beautiful thing? And that stayed with me as I've watched in the last 6 months this country moving in these extraordinary directions. So I'll come back to that. But let me start by saying when I'm talking to companies, I put those 4 pots up. They're 4 pots that all of us have to grapple with. On the far right is who's going to do it. As you try and shape your business and deal with the kind of forces that are changing us, whether they're social or economic or political, all of us have to say, well, who's going to do this? And what do leaders need to equip themselves to do this if you take seriously my point that how you got in the room and what you're doing in the room is not how you're going to get out of the room. So if you accept the fundamental idea, as Alvin Toffler predicted in 1979, that future shock is going to change everything around us. Then, of course, you've got to unlearn, and you've got to think about, well, where do you fit in to the learning and unlearning formula? And that's why I say how we've got in the room and what we're doing in the room is not how we're going to get out of the room. So who's going to do this? And what I would like to share with you is a very simple idea, is that all leaders like us need a map and a mirror. So sitting here, you've got an interesting grasp of the map. Because if you look around the geography of where we are, and you look at Johannesburg and Gauteng, the greater metro, we're in this extraordinarily complex, interesting economic hub. Someone said to me the other day that the way South Africa is arranged is there's a place called Cape Town, which is a lot like Nice. That's meant to provoke some response. They've got a mountain, it's kind of sweet, and we gave them a 234-year head start in Johannesburg, because they got 1652 and we got 1886, and 6 years later we'd overtaken them, and they've never really recovered. So he said, Cape Town's Nice. It's cosmopolitan, it's sophisticated, it's complex, of course, but that's what it is. It's a bit slower. The sea breezes waft in. He said, Johannesburg is Detroit. I thought that was interesting. Why did he say Detroit? He said Detroit because Detroit, until 20 years ago, was the center of the global auto industry. And 40 years ago, when I first came to Johannesburg, this was the center of the world's mining. And this entire economic complex is distinguished from Malawi by the simple fact of deep-level gold mining. And around deep-level gold mining, with all of its awkward stories, we built a complex economy of finance, our banks amongst the best in the world. We even have strange people called auditors who are rated in the top 5 in the world. We built industrial engineering companies. Finally, multinationals came. We built an auto industry, and we even have Nestle. So what we did out of this natural resource is build a highly competitive economy, but on the foundations of social and economic injustice. So that's what happened. What Detroit is, what Elon Musk, a guy from Pretoria, nogal, has managed to do is shift the balance of innovation from Detroit to California in the last 10 years. So he said, look, mining's declining. Our manufacturing has dropped by 50% since 1994 because of the China effect. Technology is going to reduce jobs. This is Detroit. And I then went and read up a bit about Detroit, and I love all this food because in Detroit they're doing urban farming. 1/3 of all homes have been abandoned in Detroit, and the city council have pulled them down because they're made out of wood, and people are farming. They're millibura in the middle of Detroit. Now I'm exaggerating a bit, but not far. So he said there's Nice and Detroit. And then there's some areas that he would broadly call Kenya. Those of you who've been to Nairobi, I grew up there. It sort of works. It's got a big middle class. The education's reasonable. People are energetic. They walk twice as fast as they do in many other places. And East Africa, you can see in the next 20 years as a node. And then he said the rest is Nigeria. And I thought and scratched my head about that because I've been to Nigeria. How many of you have been to London? Lagos? A number of you. How would you describe it in one word? Chaotic. You can add another word. You were going to go with chaotic. That's when creativity fails. All right. A friend of mine and I were leaving Lagos after 4 days. And we walked in the Mohammed Murtala airport, that big, huge airport. And as we walked in, the lights went. Gone. Nobody even looked up. It's just how it is, right? 16 million people moving at 3 times our speed with almost none of our infrastructure, with no sort of institutional backbone. And they are very energetic. I'm proposing to government that we move Nigeria in Zim. I think if we put 30 million Nigerians into Zim, South Africa's growth rate would double in about 3 years. What do you think? And when I say a lot of us it looks like Nigeria, I then went to look at how government spends its money. Government spends its money through a system called equitable share, which is each province gets an equitable share of the national treasury's resources. All the provinces, except the Western Cape and Gauteng, are bankrupt. So what we do is we collect all the taxes from everybody, and then we send it out to Limpopo, Mpumalanga, Eastern Cape, etc. And all of them would be bankrupt if we didn't have South Africa. In other words, same is true of Britain. If you took London out of Britain, it would be derelict. So I thought that was an interesting image about the map and how you make your own map. And as I often say, if you drive to work most days, maybe you'll wake up when you get there because you're doing it out of routine. And this era that we're in requires us to abandon our assumptions to take on a journey of exploration, to risk, because the world does not need our permission to change. And 18-year-old young men and women who are unemployed and unemployable but have got a matric certificate don't need our permission to take action. And so we're living in this incredible era of change. And my question is, who's going to do it? The next question, for some of you may be relevant, is an organization is an assembly of resources and institutions and processes, and we have to redesign them. We're still stuck in the 20th century of job descriptions and parking bays. I went to visit Vodafone in Amsterdam, and I was amazed. The CEO, South African, and he said, come up to the third floor. And I got to the third floor. I was looking for his office, and I said, well, do you know where his office is? The guy says he doesn't have an office. So I started looking around the third floor. It was very cool and trendy, a bit like this. And eventually I found Rob Schutter with his laptop over his shoulder. He said, I don't have an office. Now, there's a guy who spent 20 years at Nedbank and then 5 years at Vodacom. He said, I have learned more through random encounters than any other meeting, memo, or anything else. He said, life is moving so quickly for us here in Vodafone Netherlands that we have to engage randomly. So I thought a bit about that. Downstairs on the first floor were customers, only customers and Vodafone people allowed there. On the second floor are incubators, innovators, developing new apps for Vodafone. And the top floor, the third floor, is only for Vodafone people. I then went across the channel to London and went to the Google office. And I have to tell you, the average age in Google is about 28. 40% are British, the other 60% are not. And they run around the building. It's extraordinary to see this energy. So our idea of how an organization should be run, and the systems and cultures and processes, is way, way out of date, I think. Because to deal with all the trends that Peter's talking about, we've got to rethink what an organization is. Now, many of you are in a complex ecosystem in the media, so you kind of get a significant part of it. The third part is just the strategy. What are we going to do? How do we do it differently? How do we do it better than our rivals? And the word strategy has two meanings. The one is the strategist. It's a Greek word, actually, surprisingly. They're obviously not taking their own advice, given where Greece is. But it's to do with the leader, the strategos, and the strategia, the content of the ideas. So broadly what I'm trying to say in these first few minutes is all leaders need a mirror to ask themselves, why are they in the room? How did we all get in the room? What are we doing in the room? And what's really driving us? And are we prepared to rethink? Because what I'm suggesting to you is this country is going to go through faster and faster change, and it's going to drive us all in a different way. And of course, that's the last part. The last part is, so what is going on around you? I've been doing surveys at Gibbs amongst executives in groups like yours for about 5 years now. What percent of what executives think about what's going on in the country do you think comes from the media? So talk to your friend for 2 seconds and say, what percent of what people think about is going on in the country comes from the media? Have a go. What would be your guess? Monty. How are you, Good to see you. You well? Long time. Nikki, lovely to see you. What do you think? What do you think? Okay, so I'm not going to tease you with answers, but at Gibbs, people say about 90% of their understanding of what reality is in the country comes from the media. Social media, print, radio, television. I then often ask them, if we've got time, what's the central problem? What's the longer-term problem that's going to make or break us as a political economy, as a society? And most executives say it's public education. That we are no longer a mining economy, we're a services economy, we're a knowledge economy. And in a knowledge economy, as we all know, your education system has to be at the cutting edge because you're competing with an extraordinarily different set of economic challenges. And I asked them, well, what is it about the public education system that's the biggest problem? They all say, primary school maths. That's it. We are outscored by Malawi in primary school maths. So then I say to them, but how do you know it's the problem? And of course, so the answer is it's all through the media. So you play a vital role in shaping the appetites, habits, mindsets of South Africans. And that's got to do with the context in which we are. Right, let me move to there. Did your parents ever force you to do this? Any of you do this for fun? Any of you doing it now? That's a good sign. Okay. Tell us, what is this about? So again, talk to your neighbor quickly, couple of seconds. What is the nature of chess? You can't say it's chess because we know it's chess. What's the nature of chess? What's it about? Don't talk to me, talk to your neighbor. Have you got no friends?
Maar bound by rules binne 'n beperkte framework.
Okay. So most people, if they have enough time, we start getting into, the goal of the game is to checkmate the king. And you learn to do that as you study the rules and what the different pieces can do. And if you really get sophisticated, you study how to play the game and the moves, kind of opening moves that can be made. What happens if you're a world champion? If you Boris Spassky or Kasparov? What do you do? What do you have to know? So you have to know millions of options, right? Because every move that gets made, there are a series of options. How many steps ahead do you think the world champions think? So most companies that I work with think 1, maybe 2 steps ahead at the most. Most of us are living our lives as though it's just going to continue the way it is. The thing about chess, it's about options, and strategy is about developing options. Someone said to me a teasing comment about strategy. He said, strategy is when you've got to choose between 2 equally attractive options. If they're not equally attractive, you don't have a strategy. You just have one option. That is not a strategy. Well, that's a very tough bar to succeed at. But the question is, what moves can you make? And the thing about chess is it's rational. There are very clear rules. So many so many places on the board, so many players, they can do different things. We know what the goal is. What do you think? Is that what business is? And I argue absolutely not. Business is much more like that. This is another form of chess. Anybody know what this is? It's not a meeting of the DA and the EFF. I have had that suggested. It's Warren Buffett, could be. I get Britain's Got Talent, and I get Church. You warm. This is the final of the World of Warcraft, the online game where people pay $100 to come and sit in the crowd. These are the commentators. They speak twice as fast as horse racing announcers. Up there. The players aren't actually there, and this is the final. I got onto this because an 18-year-old last January gave a talk before me, and to my great irritation, he was paid the same fee as me. And he said he's a gamer. And he's the son of a friend of mine. I said, what do you mean he's a gamer? And I know him well. So the following Saturday, I went to visit him to teach me to play a bit of the World of Warcraft. And what he said is he's played 6,000 hours. Now I've found out that there are 500 million people that game. And that gaming is used by the US military to develop leaders. And when he got up to speak about leadership, he said, just let me share with you. He said, my parents think I'm a nerd because I spend all my time at the computer. What they don't know is how cool this is on dates, but that's a different subject. He said to me, I've got to make instant decisions with people I've never met, that I'll never work with again, in a highly competitive contest where the rules are kind of infinite. I thought, gee, I come the world of chess. If Absa can beat Standard Bank, hip hip hooray. No, that's not where we are. So the kind of world that's unfolding, I used to hope would look like that. 1994. We finally got there. Guess what? We voted. We might even get to know each other. What an astonishing idea. Here we are 24 years later, and actually, we're in that. This is the naive optimist view of life. I always say you're either an optimist or a pessimist by nature. Most of you guys, I think, tend to be optimists. That's not the interesting question of whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. The interesting question is, are you knowledgeable or naive? So you get naive optimists. Those are people in marketing. You get naive pessimists, accountants. What we want to be is have a map that's real. And that's why as I drove in, I loved where you are. Just think about, look around what's going on out there now. Because how realistic are your experiences? Because the Germans have a lovely word called Fingerspitzengefühl, the feeling in the tips of your fingers. So we are what we eat. I watched Anglo move to London, and within 3 years they'd largely changed their accents. They'd spent 100 years at 44 Main Street. Suddenly they were in London. They had thin little ties like Englishmen. Very sad sight. You are your context. We absorb our information, our ideas, our relationships. I look at how narrow our relationships. Go to any cocktail function and just watch how the patterns of interaction behave. I was at a big auditing firm last night, 150 people. By the end of the evening, it had been defined in the characteristic South African fashion. So we don't know each other. We're not having the kind of intimacy. Many of you are because of maybe what you do, but South Africans generally have not, certainly the leadership. I don't think the leadership know if it's Tuesday or September. It seems to me that we're being led by a generation that are totally out of touch with what 18 and 19-year-olds, the people you're trying to talk to, think. So I think we're in these white waters, and I think it's very challenging to paddle your canoe. If you're going to paddle on that, that's one thing. If you're going to paddle on that, you better have your wits around you. This is an American academic, Mike Tyson. And I quite liked what he had to say. Because on the day of Nenegate, we took one of those clubs. On the reshuffle a couple of months ago, we took another club. And it looks to me in a zero growth economy, or 1%, which is the same as zero, it's not sustainable. You can't increase your population year after year. 750,000 matriculants come out. You employ only 20% of them and expect to be in a stable society. Now, what I want to say is we're all intimately connected to this. It's intimate in everything we do and say. And so what I'm just encouraging you to think about as you shape the ideas that will take your business and yourself forward is, are you sure that you're intimately connected to the sociology of South Africa, to the psychology of South Africa, to the anthropology of South Africa, to these much softer, harder to discern trends about preferences and patterns, because of course that's your role. So basically, I say it again, how we've got in the room and what we're doing in the room is not how we're going to get out. And there are the known knowns, the things you can take for granted, the things you assume you can take for granted about the nature of the market in 2018. The things you know you've got to start working on to shift. And what I saw Peter deliver was some of that. And then realizing that there are just a big bunch of unknown unknowns. So that's the central question in strategy that you might want to reflect on and ask yourself, what's your answer to that? What can you do that the market wants or will want you to do, insight and foresight, that the competitors can't do? And although we're going to talk about radical economic transformation and inclusive capitalism, South Africa, by and large, in business terms, still holds on to the idea of competition. Many South Africans don't like the idea of competition, but I think business works in its oligopolistic structures reasonably competitive. These are the states of mind that I often come across. The first is that we're too busy to have a strategy. I call it the Stutterfords effect. Do you remember Stutterfords? Then there's the passive defensive. We're a dominant player. We've just got to protect ourselves from the downturn. Very bad idea. Then there's what I call the Japanese strategy, which is learn from the Americans and then do it better than them. That's how they built Toyota. They had a labor force, they taught them fundamentals of quality and production, and the next thing they were invading the USA. And then there's this remarkable thing that's going on, and Peter touched on them. There are these amazing new enterprises, forms of enterprise, technologies, and I'm busy reading Elon Musk. I urge you all to read the book about him. Because I can't remember where there was a pioneering... Bill Gates lived in Seattle, where I studied. He was cool. Jobs was amazing. But this visionary capacity, combined with his intellect, combined with his determination to answer a problem, is what distinguishes Elon Musk. And what really distinguishes him, it's across multiple areas of endeavor, between space and cars. Now he wants to tunnel under Los Angeles. The guy's nuts. I don't know what they did to him in Pretoria, but it was clearly very damaging. I'm going to argue in a frontier society like this, in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to have to find the pioneering types, the mavericks. A maverick is someone who won't do it the same way as you, but shares your values. How do we liberate the mavericks in South African society to get that right? Because these are the people who will shape the nature of the world we're going to live in. I'm convinced of it. And so, if you like reading that stuff, have a look at how he thinks. Now, here's a cool dude, Hussein. I'm sure you all watched the 100 meters in Rio. What happens in the 100 meters? I call it Monday, because it's the sudden release of pent-up energy. Isn't that how you feel on Monday morning? And it takes 10-point-something seconds. And if you study the physiology of the race, you've got to have big thighs, and you've got to have long muscle cultures, which Jamaicans do, and then you've got to run your ass off very, very quickly. And they taught them in the 80s never to look how the other guy's doing. Because, the guy would be running, I think I'm winning, and you have a look and he comes third. Except for Bolt. When Bolt gets to 80 meters, he starts waving at the Jamaicans. He's just so far ahead of everybody else. Go and watch some interviews with him and see his sort of character, his energy, his personality, his playfulness, his positive outlook. Now, the question I started thinking about, because I'm meant to be a business school professor, is why did the Jamaicans win? As you may know, there are 360 million Americans, and there are 2 million Jamaicans. How come 2 million Jamaicans won every single sprint, men and women, at the Rio Olympics? Any offers? The first offer I normally get, it's the ganja. Why? So I went and studied it, and to cut the story short, turns out that the West Africans that went to Jamaica have very good particular muscle types that make it very good for explosive release of energy. Jamaica is a very poor country, so they entered sports that had zero cost. They didn't do pole vault or American football. They did running. And then in the 60s and 70s, a few Jamaicans started winning because of their natural skills, and instead of kind of pushing them aside, the whole country started focusing on them, making them heroes. We don't have heroes here, we only have villains. They made them heroes. And then I discovered a fantastic thing, because there has to be a system. And what it's called, you love this, it's the Intercollegiate High School Championship. It happens in Kingston once a year, and the whole country comes to a halt while all the schools send their best athletes for the sprints. And now success starts breeding success. And all the coaches from Rio are being recruited by the Germans and the Polish and the Japanese. Not that I think they'll do well. The Japanese, they're my height. This is another race. So this is the stamina I believe we're going to need in the next 3 to 5 years. This is a race of stamina. And South Africans are feeling tentative about their commitment. I'm hearing around the Sandton dinner table a lot of Plan B discussion. What time does the Australian embassy close? Right? I mean, we sent our last generation of rejects there. I'm joking. This is a long race. This is a race of tactics, a race of intellect, a race of pain. And I think we're going to head into another bumpy area. I was just telling Valda and Peter that I was at this past presidential dialogue 3 weeks ago. I don't know if you saw it in the papers. But Thabo Mbeki, Kgalema Motlanthe, and F.W. de Klerk, and by satellite, we had our female ex-president who's briefly president. Help me. Sorry? Phumzile. And all four said, we are in a crisis. So I asked, do you really mean we're in a crisis? Because a crisis is an imminent catastrophe. If we're in a crisis, we have to take radical action. And they said, yes, we're in a crisis. I said, okay, so then we have another level of energy to deal with both the short and the long run. And this is where I think leadership comes in. Have South Africans got the courage to lead? Have we got the commitment to say, look, sitting where we are, we're going to make this work. And I'm a piece of making it work, and I'm not going anywhere. When my daughter Jordan, who's now 22, was about 6, I drove from the Eastern Cape to Cape Town. And as you heard, I come from Cape Town. As we went over the mountains, she was in a car seat, I said, Jordan, there's my mountain. He said, where, Dad, where? I said, there. The Table Mountain was on the horizon. I said, there. He said, where, Dad? There. He said, Dad, that can't be your mountain. It's too big. I said, Jordan, that's my mountain. I just let lots of people use it. So the question as leaders is, what are you claiming? Are you living out of the fear? Are you living out of the hope? Are you living out of action? And how broad should our action be? Let me just say this to finish this. Business is a healing agency in this country. It's the part that works. I'm convinced if we took 50 schools visible from here and gave them each to one company to help operate, we'd turn those schools around. Government is becoming dysfunctional. Apart from all the surface level discussion, it's just struggling to deliver. And the ring of fire around Joburg is not going away. Every night I watch the protest action. And we're heading to June. We'll talk about that in a minute. So this is the longer run of, do you really want to be in the room? What's the purpose of your work? Why are you in business? Can you motivate or think about a higher level role that we can play as business people? About understanding our country, about having the insights, and about sharing what needs to be done. I'm going to be very quick. I often show this because we live in an extraordinary era. Human beings have never progressed as fast as they are now. In my lifetime, we've gone from 2.5 to 7 billion. There was 1 billion in 1800. We went to 2.5 billion in 250 years. We've gone from 2.5 billion to 7 billion in one person's lifetime. And then if you look at the progress, because if you read that, that's how long you expect to live. These are all the countries. That's the United States. That's Europe at war. There's China. There's India. There's Africa. 1940. Just look at 2010. And these are real incomes. They're inflation-adjusted incomes. Just go back and look. One lifetime of, look at China, of unbelievable progress. My best pick for the 20th century leader is Deng Xiaoping. Let me leave it there. Look at that. The great acceleration, back to 1750. All of these start in 1750. We are living in an exponential world in all those extraordinary topics. Similar kind of thing. Child mortality, that's where it was. 40% of kids died before the age of 7. 3 or 7, I can't read it. Now it's 4. Vaccination, no one was vaccinated. Now 90% of people are vaccinated. Basic education, very few people were educated. Now almost everybody has a basic education. Extreme poverty, not enough to eat. Look what we've done. We've lived in a world of tremendous progress. Now, I'm going to have a Zilla moment, because this is Singapore. Singapore in 1950, 60, earned about $600 per person per year. When the British left, they took everything they could. They tried to move the port, but it wouldn't budge, but they took everything else. The Foreign Office wrote a memo to the Prime Minister saying, the Chinese are lazy. They won't amount to much. 70 years later, they ranked the most competitive economy in the world. They import 90% of their food. They've increased the size of the island by 13%. Now, how do you increase the size of an island? The answer is you cut your mountains down and put them in the sea. When you run out of mountain, you buy Indonesian sand. Then the Indonesians found out they were buying the sand to expand the island, so they stopped selling them sand. It's called a low IQ moment. I'm sure many of you have been there. People living 40 years longer, earning 100 times more, and it's got a strain of authoritarianism, no question about it. They built their underground metro 3 months ahead of schedule, 70% of budget. The first day they opened the underground, kids put chewing gum on the electronic eyes to keep the door open. The next day, Singapore banned chewing gum. Old men in lifts used to pee in the lift because they were used to living on a kampong in a rural area. Suddenly they put in big flats, they'd pee in the lift. First time a warning, second time a fine, third time a couple of days in jail, and then the government realized we have to put uric acid detectors in the lift. That way the door closes, we can call the police. So it's an authoritarian regime. It's sort of democratic, but often not really. At the micro level, this is having lunch, which I know you're interested in. This is an alleyway in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City. There's the kitchen I'm going to show you. There's the entrance to the hotel I stay at, the Bai Saigon Hotel. I get a room there for $30 a night, huge DSTV, Wi-Fi, everything I want. There are people having lunch. There's the menu stand, like French style. 130 items, 30-page menu. Everything is cooked to order in the kitchen. And I love gazing at that photograph. Just have a look. What do you see? There's the food and veggies, there are the woks, there are the gas bottles, there are the condiments, there's the scullery, and everyone's doing something. She's having some lunch, but everybody's doing something. A main course is $1.30. The first breakfast I had, I asked for pawpaw, and about 5 minutes later they brought it and put it down. I thought they'd made a mistake. They'd given me a plastic flower. They'd carved the pawpaw to look like a flower. That's the micro-level competitiveness. Often show this, I have for many years, so this is a museum nearby. $20 gets you an acrylic oil copy. So these are hand-painted copies. There's Van Gogh, there's Monet, there's Superman, whatever. And so I thought I'd give an experiment. I gave them a little Kodak photo of my daughter. She was about 8 then, just a little picture. I said, how long, how much? That's what you learn to say in Asia. It's a language. How long, how much? They said 24 hours, $25, and there it is. That's at the micro level. Oh, and there's the guy who painted it, 19 years old. So I suppose what I'm saying is I don't want much of that. You can lose a country. It's very embarrassing. It's like, I've put it somewhere. It's gone. This will not recover, I don't think, in my lifetime, although my life expectancy is being reduced. We don't want to stuff it up. And we've got every reason to be successful. Here are some of the big things I see. I'm going to wrap up, but let me say to you, we've got everything going for us. The problem is we're asleep. So we've got the infrastructure, we've got the institutions, we've got a great constitution, we've got a free media, we've got a big middle class. Just look where you are. But we're sleeping. We're not growing. And a lot of that growth is that we don't trust each other, we don't really know each other, we're not really being creative yet, we're not tapping into the pools of creativity. And as we leave more and more people behind, there's no question it's going to become a more contested domain. I think these are the timelines that, if you ask me to look ahead, we've got the preparatory knife fight in a few weeks on the policy conference. Then we've got the big knife fight in December. And then we've got, heading to the election, 18 months of amazing contestation, because I think, my guess is, this election is fairly open. We saw local government. And then we've got to say, well, what the hell are we going to do afterwards? And these are 3 timelines. That takes you through 3 years. In the middle of that, you and I have to decide what to do. These are what I think our killer apps are. I've mentioned them. We've got a constitutional, we've got an amazing constitution, amazing legal. The lawyers have really stepped over the boundary and really played a huge role based on that fantastic constitution. I'm sure you've all been to the court. The thing I loved about going to the Constitutional Court is they never closed the door. That door is open 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. It never closes. Only court in the world where that's true. We've got amazing institutions. No country has produced the kind of businesses that we have. The size of country, SAB, Steinhoff, you name them. It's an incredible system that we've built. And we need to weigh it up and value it properly. Our infrastructure. You won't find infrastructure like this anywhere in Africa. You know that. I've talked about that, the middle class, and I've talked about that's our long-term future, and of course, it's all about services. So let me end there by saying, as I did at the beginning, that strategy is about options. And maybe the question you've got to reflect on is, do you have an idea of what is next? Is it provocative? Is it powerful? Would it scare the crap out of your competitors? Would it delight your customers? Is it around value that you understand, where the value lies, because your map is big? It's very hard to know if a company has a good strategy. Normally we look at its actions. All of us have a strategy. You may say, well, what is he talking about? All of us have a strategy. Strategy is simply the sum of what you do on a Friday. What do you do? That's your strategy. So if we look at the actions, we say there's a clear pattern, there's not. The financial results matter, but as accountants have taught us in the last 15 years, it really is paint by numbers. We have no idea what a company's worth anymore. 30 years ago, you counted the physical product and added a bit of goodwill. Today, most valuation is almost impossible. Accountants are frustrated artists. It's, I suppose, a way of asking if you've got a good strategy is, are people happy? Are people inside your organization fulfilled and happy? Do they like each other? Do they feel good about what they do? Have you defined a purpose about what you're doing? And are your customers happy? I think often in marketing the most important people for all of us is our non-customers. Why are our non-customers our non-customers? Because that's where the growth lies. And then how much of your action and time is linked to the next and the innovation? So let me end by saying I'm going to encourage you to start traveling and to invest time randomly and start looking around and drive different routes to work and go and find the crevices and the experiences and the people that you may differ with, but who will excite you with their energy. Because in a creative industry, the merger between that sociology and the technology is where I think the future lies. We always say our rate of learning must be higher than the rate of change. What I've realized about many South African companies is the rate of unlearning has to be higher than the rate of change. Thank you very much.